0917, October the 25th, 1944. Aboard the largest battleship ever built, a vice admiral raised his binoculars and looked south. What he saw filled his gun sights. 6 enemy carriers. His own fleet, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 11 destroyers, had already sunk one of them. 3 more were in range. His guns outranged theirs by miles. His armor laughed at their bombs. He had more firepower concentrated in his battle line than existed anywhere else in the Pacific Ocean at that moment. The American ships were running at flank speed, and they were not going to get away. And then, at approximately 0920, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita gave an order that has never been fully explained. He ordered his fleet to turn around. The carriers escaped. The invasion of the Philippines continued. And the debate over what Kurita was thinking in those few minutes, what he saw, what he feared, what he decided, has been argued by naval historians for 80 years without resolution.
To understand what made Kurita's decision so remarkable, you have to understand what his fleet was doing there in the first place, and what it had already survived to reach that position. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought across 4 days in late October of 1944, was the largest naval engagement in history, measured by the number of ships involved. The United States was landing an invasion force on the island of Leyte in the central Philippines. Japan's response was a plan of extraordinary complexity and desperation. A coordinated 3-pronged naval attack designed to destroy the invasion transports and push the Americans out of the Philippines entirely. The plan was called Sho-Go, Operation Victory. It required 3 separate Japanese forces to converge on Leyte Gulf from different directions simultaneously, with each force playing a specific role in luring, fixing, and destroying the American fleet.
Kurita commanded the most powerful of the 3 forces, designated Center Force. His fleet centered on 5 battleships, including the Yamato and the Nagato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Yamato alone displaced 65,000 tons and carried the largest naval guns ever built, 18-inch rifles that could hurl a shell weighing 3,000 pounds over 25 miles. There was nothing in the Pacific that could absorb a hit from that gun and survive. Kurita's assignment was the most direct and the most dangerous. Transit the Sibuyan Sea, pass through the San Bernardino Strait, and emerge on the eastern side of the Philippines, directly behind the main American landing force. Once there, he was to enter Leyte Gulf and sink everything he found: the transports, the supply ships, the escorts. The invasion force depended on those ships. Without them, the soldiers already ashore had no supplies, no reinforcement, no way home.
The problem with Sho-Go was that it required everything to go right simultaneously, and almost nothing did. The plan depended on a southern force under Vice Admiral Nishimura arriving at Leyte Gulf from the south at the same time Kurita arrived from the north, catching the Americans between 2 fires. Nishimura's force was destroyed in Surigao Strait during the night of October the 24th, ambushed in one of the last great battleship actions of the war. The 3rd Japanese force, a carrier group sent north specifically to lure the main American fleet away from the landing area, succeeded in its deception, drawing Admiral Halsey and his powerful Task Force 38 north in pursuit of what Halsey believed was the main Japanese threat. That left the San Bernardino Strait and the waters east of Samar covered by a force that Halsey did not think needed to be there, a collection of escort carriers designated Taffy 3. Center Force had paid a steep price before it ever reached the San Bernardino Strait. On October the 23rd, American submarines found the fleet in the Palawan Passage and attacked. The submarines sank the heavy cruiser Otago, Kurita's own flagship, and the Takeo and the Maya within the space of a few hours. Kurita was in the water.
He survived by swimming to a destroyer and transferring his flag to the Yamato, but he had spent time in the oil-slicked Philippine Sea watching his command ship sink, and he arrived on his new bridge soaking wet. By the following day, air attacks found center force in the Sibuyan Sea. American carrier aircraft struck the fleet repeatedly through the daylight hours, scoring hits that slowed several ships and sank the super battleship Musashi, the Yamato's sister and the largest ship Japan had ever built, after 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits failed to stop her, and a 20th torpedo finally did. The men who had watched the Musashi roll over and go down were the same men steering into the San Bernardino Strait that night.
Through the night of the 24th and the early hours of the 25th, Center Force transited the San Bernardino Strait in darkness. The strait was undefended. Halsey had taken his fleet north. There were no American ships blocking the passage, no picket line, no warning. Kurita emerged into the Philippine Sea and turned south toward Leyte Gulf, his battle line intact. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers. In the pre-dawn darkness, his radar rooms tracked no contacts ahead. The transit had cost more ships and more men than the plan could easily absorb, but the mission objective was still achievable. Leyte Gulf was 200 miles to the south. The invasion transports were there. If Center Force reached them, the operation could still succeed. What Kurita did not know, what no one told him, because the communications between Japanese forces had been fragmentary throughout the operation, was that Nishimura's southern force had already been annihilated in the night.
At 0644, on the morning of October the 25th, Center Force's lookouts spotted masts on the southern horizon. Kurita had found the enemy. He ordered his ships to battle stations and began closing the range. What he believed he had found, based on the silhouettes and on the assumption that Halsey's fast carriers had to be somewhere in the area, was a force of fleet carriers, screened by cruisers and destroyers, a powerful combat formation. His battle reports written after the fact state this clearly. He believed he had engaged carrier forces far beyond what he had actually found. The force he had actually found was Task Unit 774.3, known by its radio call sign as Taffy 3, under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. Taffy 3 consisted of 6 escort carriers, small, slow, thin-hulled vessels designed for anti-submarine patrol and close air support, not fleet combat, screened by 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. Its total displacement was roughly 32,000 tons. Kurita's fleet displaced over 300,000.
There is something important to understand about why Kurita misidentified what he was looking at. Escort carriers, CVEs as the Americans designated them, were not small in the way that the word suggests to a modern ear. They were converted freighters, 150 meters long, displacing around 10,000 tons each. From a distance, through sea haze, at combat ranges where optical identification is genuinely difficult, the silhouette of an escort carrier is not entirely like the silhouette of a fleet carrier. The escorting destroyers and destroyer escorts, making smoke and maneuvering at high speed, could look at a distance like cruisers. Kurita had no air reconnaissance at that stage of the battle. He had the silhouettes and the geometry of the engagement, and the geometry suggested a powerful force. His signal officer read the mast heights and reported fleet carriers. Whatever the reason, misidentification, the fog of a 3-day running engagement, the shock of 3 days of losses, Kurita went into the Battle of Samar believing he was facing something far more dangerous than he actually was. When Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague saw the pagoda masts of Japanese battleships rising over the northern horizon, he understood immediately how completely outmatched his command was.
His first response was to order his carriers to turn south into the wind, to launch aircraft, to lay smoke, and to radio for help. The help request went out in the clear, uncoded, because there was no time, and it reached Halsey's fleet 400 miles to the north and the other Taffy groups operating nearby. Whether that help would arrive in time was a question no one could answer. Sprague knew what his carriers could and could not do. Their flight decks were loaded with aircraft carrying depth charges for submarine hunting and general-purpose bombs designed to crack open concrete airstrips, not armor-piercing ordnance capable of penetrating battleship steel. His pilots could attack Kurita's ships, and they did, flying sortie after sortie throughout the engagement, but they could not sink a battleship with what they had. The best they could do was distract, confuse, and delay.
The destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3 did something that is, by any measure, among the most remarkable acts of the entire Pacific War. Sprague ordered them forward. The 3 destroyers, the Johnston, the Howell, and the Heermann, and the 4 destroyer escorts, small ships, 600 to 1,300 tons, turned toward Kurita's fleet and attacked. The Johnston, a destroyer, charged a column of cruisers and battleships alone, firing torpedoes and her 5-inch guns until she was dead in the water. She absorbed 3 14-inch shells and then 3 6-inch shells in the first minutes of her charge and kept firing. Commander Ernest Evans, the Johnston's captain, had sounded general quarters before the enemy was even in range, anticipating what was coming. The Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort, made a torpedo run on Kurita's heavy cruisers at such close range that her crew could see the Japanese sailors on the enemy decks. She was hit repeatedly and sank. The Howell was struck 40 times before she went down. These were not fleet combatants designed for this kind of engagement. They were picket vessels, convoy escorts. They attacked a battle fleet.
The effect of the destroyer attacks was disproportionate to the size of the ships producing it. Kurita's formation, which had been approaching in a disciplined battle line, broke up. His ship commanders, seeing torpedo tracks crossing their paths, took evasive action independently rather than maintaining the steady approach that would have closed the range fastest. The Yamato herself, evading 2 torpedo salvos from the Johnston, ran north at high speed for nearly 10 minutes, directly away from the carriers, before she could safely turn back. The Japanese cruisers pressing from the flanks were slowed by the need to deal with destroyers that simply would not stop attacking. Kurita, watching from the Yamato's bridge, could see his ships absorbing fire and maneuvering, but could not see the big picture clearly. His communications with individual squadron commanders were fragmentary. He was receiving reports that described fleet carriers under attack, that suggested powerful enemy forces nearby. The battle around him was producing exactly the kind of information that confirmed his original misidentification.
The escort carrier Gambier Bay, the slowest of the 6 in Taffy 3, fell behind the others as the group ran south. Kurita's heavy cruisers closed on her and began landing hits from their 8-inch guns. A cruiser's 8-inch shell goes through an escort carrier's hull the way a rifle bullet goes through cardboard. The Gambier Bay's engine room flooded. Her speed fell again, and she capsized and sank at approximately 0910. She was the only carrier sunk by surface gunfire in the entire Pacific War. The 430 men who survived her sinking spent the next 2 days in the water, sharing the sea with sharks. Several dozen did not survive the wait for rescue. For Kurita, the sinking of the Gambier Bay was the clearest visible evidence that his guns were working, that his fleet, battered and depleted as it was still capable of doing what it had come to do. And it was at approximately this moment, with the remaining carriers seemingly at his mercy and his cruisers closing in from 3 sides, that the order came to turn north. The order, issued at approximately 0920, was to cease the pursuit and reorganize. Kurita assembled his fleet to the north. He held that position for about 90 minutes. During that time,
his staff debated whether to attempt a second run south toward Leyte Gulf, the original objective. The debate, as best as it can be reconstructed from the accounts of officers who were present, turned on several factors that Kurita could not resolve with certainty. He had received a signal, interpreted, possibly misinterpreted, that led him to believe there was a powerful American striking force somewhere to the north. He had also received reports of aircraft gathering for what seemed like a coordinated attack on his fleet. His ships were damaged and running low on fuel. His cruiser force had lost several vessels to aircraft and to the torpedo attacks of the destroyers. And he still believed, wrongly but sincerely, that he had been fighting fleet carriers. The logic he applied, if the surviving records reflected accurately, was that entering Leyte Gulf without air cover, with damaged ships, against what he believed was a more powerful enemy force somewhere nearby, was a gamble that could not pay off.
There are 5 main explanations that historians have advanced for what Kurita did, and the frustrating truth is that none of them is entirely satisfactory on its own, and all of them might simultaneously be partially true. The first is simple misidentification. Kurita believed he was fighting fleet carriers and cruisers, and when those ships seemed to escape, obscured by smoke, running hard, the CVEs faster than he expected because they were lighter than his intelligence suggested, he concluded that catching them would cost more than it was worth when a more powerful force might be approaching. The second explanation is exhaustion. Kurita had been in continuous combat for 3 days. He had survived the sinking of his flagship by swimming through an oil slick. The cognitive load on a commander in those circumstances, the accumulating uncertainty, the sleeplessness, the physical shock, is not something that battle reports can fully measure.
The third explanation is a communications failure of a specific war. During the battle, a signal arrived at Center Force that has never been definitively decoded or sourced. Kurita appears to have read it as an order to withdraw, or at least as information about a developing situation to the north that warranted his attention more urgently than the pursuit of the carriers. Whether that signal was a genuine order, a garbled transmission, or a misread relay from a distant headquarters is still not entirely clear. The fourth explanation, perhaps the most uncomfortable, is that Kurita lost faith in the mission. He had watched the Musashi go down. He had watched his cruisers absorb torpedo after torpedo from destroyers 1/10 their size. He had not heard from Nishimura. He did not know where Halsey was. The rational calculation, if he performed one at that moment, might have led him to conclude that entering Leyte Gulf with a damaged, unsupported fleet against an alerted and reinforced enemy was not a military operation. It was a sacrifice that would not change the outcome of the war.
The fifth explanation, and perhaps the one that makes the others make sense, is that Kurita's decision was not a single decision at all. It was the product of accumulated small decisions, each one defensible in isolation, that combined into an outcome no one fully intended. He ordered his ships to maneuver to avoid torpedoes, and that broke up his formation. He tried to reform his formation, and that took time. He received uncertain information and chose caution. He weighed a known cost, the attrition his fleet had already absorbed, against an uncertain reward, the chance that Leyte Gulf still held the transports and that reaching them would change anything. And somewhere in that weighing, the momentum that had carried him through the Sibuan Sea and through the San Bernardino Strait and into the waters off Samar simply stopped. He turned north. He never turned south again. He would never speak about it clearly enough to satisfy the historians who spent decades asking him to explain.
The practical consequences of Kurita's withdrawal were stark and irreversible. The escort carriers of Taffy 3, the ships his cruisers had been closing on from 3 sides, reassembled and resumed operations. The invasion transports in Leyte Gulf, which Kurita had been fewer than 2 hours off Samar, unloaded without interruption. the Leyte landings continued. The Philippines campaign, which Japan's entire Sho-Go plan had been designed to disrupt, proceeded on schedule. Kurita's fleet, having crossed the Philippine Sea and transited the San Bernardino Strait and fought for 2 hours off Samar, turned around and went home. It was caught by carrier aircraft during the retreat and lost several more ships. The Yamato survived. She would meet her own end 6 months later, in April of 1945, sent on a one-way mission to Okinawa with fuel for only a one-way voyage, and sunk by aircraft before she ever reached the island. Kurita was not aboard for that mission. His fleet command ended with the withdrawal from Samar.
The men of Taffy 3, the escort carrier sailors and the tin can sailors, as the destroyers and destroyer escorts came to be called, were awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for their actions off Samar. The citation described what they had done in language that is, even now, unusual in its directness. It acknowledged that small ships had stopped a battle fleet through sheer aggression when there was no tactical reason to believe they could. The Johnston, the Howell, and the Samuel B. Roberts were lost. Commander Evans of the Johnston, who had ordered his ship to charge a battleship column, was last seen on the capsizing hull of his destroyer, trying to help his men off the ship. He was not among the survivors. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. The battle off Samar occupies a specific and strange place in American naval memory. It is celebrated as a victory, which it was in terms of outcome, while also being a near catastrophe that was averted not by superior planning or superior force, but by the willingness of small ships to do something that should not have worked.
Kurita survived the war and lived until 1977. He gave interviews, he corresponded with historians, he answered questions, some of them very direct, about what he was thinking when he gave the order to turn. And the answers he gave across 3 decades were never fully satisfying. Not because he was evasive, necessarily, but because the question itself may not have a clean answer. He cited the communications failure. He cited the uncertainty about enemy forces to the north. He said, at various points, that he believed entering Leyte Gulf with his remaining strength would have accomplished nothing decisive. He did not say he lost his nerve. He did not say he made a mistake. He lived long enough to read some of what had been written about him, and to understand that the weight historians placed on his decision was enormous. That, in the eyes of many of them, he had held the outcome of the Philippines campaign in his hands for 90 minutes and let it go. Whatever he felt about that conclusion, he carried it for 33 years and died without resolving it to anyone's satisfaction, including, perhaps, his own.
What the battle off Samar leaves behind is a question about the nature of decisions made under extreme pressure with incomplete information and a body already pushed past its limits. Kurita had the firepower, he had the position, he had the target in range. By every material measure available to him at 0920 on October the 25th, 1944, he was winning. And then he stopped. Naval historians can tell you everything about what happened next, and very little with certainty about why. The debate has never been resolved, and the fact that it has not been resolved says something about the limits of what battle reports and post-war interviews can actually tell us about what goes on inside a commander's mind when the calculus of a 3-day engagement finally tips past the point where the rational and the human are the same thing. The invasion of Leyte continued, the Philippines were liberated, and Takeo Kurita came home and lived for another 33 years and never quite explained himself. Next on Torah Files, the day a Japanese vice admiral took off on a kamikaze mission after the emperor had already announced the surrender, because he decided the war wasn't over.
Torah files tells the untold history of the Pacific War from the Japanese